substance equals spin. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words are now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 of 200. This is the last episode before Christmas, I think. Unless suddenly someone calls me up and says, please have me on the podcast. It might be the last one for the year, depending on how I feel coming up to New Year's, and how much time and energy I have. I'm joined by my co-host, Josephine. How are you doing?
Kia ora. Yeah, I'm excited about this podcast today. We've got an interesting guest whose topic is very close to my heart. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
And that guest, welcome back to the podcast, Van. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be back.
So for those of our audience who haven't heard the previous episode with you and maybe don't know your work, can you just give us a quick intro on where you come from and what you do?
Yeah, I mean, so by experience in life and birth, I'm American, obviously.
What?
And but I teach at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. I teach international relations. I was born not born professionally, I was born as a creature of the national security state in the US, and I was trained as a strategist to think in those ways and to advise the ruling classes in that kind of mode. But I had always had one foot in the progressive movement in the US, even when I was in the military. And I served in the Obama administration. And then in the Trump years is when I came out here, and being a scholar, having distance from Washington, and then seeing America basically just go off the fucking rails in the Trump years in a way that exposed that, like, Trump was sort of a byproduct of an ongoing system. Like, the shock of Trump was that he felt like coming out of left field for a lot of us, right? But then when you start thinking about, like, well, what made Trump possible? What is the historical context, and what are the distributions of power that lead to somebody like this? You know, you start asking those kinds of questions, and you start seeing aspects of history that, you know, your teacher didn't tell you about. And that starts to be really disturbing. Way leads on to way. Eventually, you start reading about labor history and, the origins of imperialism and all these things. And before you know it, you're writing a book called Grand Strategies of the Left. So that's where I'm at.
And that's why we have you on the podcast today. You've released this book just very recently, Grand Strategies of the Left, the Foreign Policy of Progressive World-Making. It's something that I think the left, particularly in the West, has really struggled with. I think a lot of thinkers, academics, progressives in the global South have been very clear-eyed about the Western imperial project for a long time now. But something that we often fail to grapple with within these systems is, how do we turn the ship around? And I'm really interested to hear about your thoughts regarding this, Van, and especially having been within that system. How have you come to the place where you're like, okay, we need to have this document. We need to have a framework for this.
And just to add to that, can I just add to Kyle's question? So I grew up in Kerala, where we are, it's a left-wing communist state in India. And we grow up with this anti-imperialist perspective. We identify Western imperialism as an ongoing system. But then, in the 90s, what happened in India is what happened in a lot of global South countries is, in exchange for loans, the IMF shoved neoliberalism down India's throat. And since then, we are getting media that kind of projects the West as, purveyor of human rights. And we are, the young people in India who grew up in the 90s, are just bombarded with media narratives from the West. So it is really important that we are clear-eyed about this. And I found myself going back to those discussions that were there around me in my childhood, which were critiquing this dominant narrative coming from the West. So, yeah, in that light as well, Van.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, like, the dominance of the sort of Washington and Western narratives are subsidiary of Washington narratives to a large degree. But the ability to sustain that and make it feel like there is no alternative, and this is just how the world works. And if without American beneficence, the world goes to shit. That idea, it requires erasing the view, like what Edward Said would point us toward, which is like, who suffers for what we do? You know, we provide security for ourselves, we say, but at whose expense, you know? And the experience of people on the receiving end of IMF loans, you know, that's or Cold War militarism. We have to erase those voices and those standpoints and those historical memories, because if we don't, our narrative cannot hold up, you know. And so this is part of the problem, is like American foreign policy is indexed or anchored on an image of itself that doesn't hold up to historical scrutiny. It's not historically accurate, you know? So with the book, there was like an opening chapter that's basically just documenting the infinite list of critiques of liberal internationalism as it's actually existed. And I don't even like, fuck realism. Like, I don't even bother dealing with that. It's liberal internationalism is the prevailing paradigm for the West, for Washington. And so documenting the crimes done in its name and why it's a problem, that is the starting point, making that critique clear and vocal. And then that's the starting point for like, okay, given that, how can we consider a different way? And what have leftists considered as different ways of relating to the world? In terms of like the origins of the project, the presidential campaigns in 2020, I ended up on 4 of the campaigns as unpaid advisors sequentially because my candidate kept losing. And, and so the way presidential campaigns in the US work, like, you know, you're aligning yourself with a specific person and giving them your best policy advice, and then they take it or leave it or whatever. But then when that campaign folds, the next hot campaign tries to absorb all the talent from the other campaigns. And so like, as long as you're in good standing, it tends to be the case that you would like hop around. So I hopped the shit out of the campaigns in 2020. And what's really
Can
weird.
I ask which campaigns? Sorry.
So I cannot name 2 of them because of so one of the weird things about Washington is like non-disclosure agreements are all over the place. The 2 that I can name that I don't have NDAs for is Elizabeth Warren and Julian Castro.
Oh.
So those 2 did not require me to sign NDAs, so I can say that.
Yeah, I remember both of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, so like those campaigns, it was a weird moment in time, a unique moment in time in my lifetime, where the managerial class of foreign policy wonks, they were uniquely open to alternatives to the prevailing paradigm in foreign policy. They were uniquely open to something other than liberal internationalism. The primacy, they recognized that there were a lot of these critiques. They didn't accept all the critiques, but they understood that it wasn't popular. And so they're like, all right, well, what else can we do? We've got a bankrupt paradigm. And in that moment, there was tons of like discursive energy coming out of the left. Even some of it seeped into mainstream media. But none of it was expressed in a grammar that the national security state people could like wrap their minds around. Like it doesn't, like militarism isn't literally a foreign concept to them. And if you can't table the concept of militarism as part of a conversation of foreign policy, then there's no conversation to be had. I mean, like, what are you talking? So like, it was a Mars versus Venus kind of problem. So in that moment when we were casting around for alternatives, and I was very low, I was not like influential by any means. And so my voice didn't matter much, but I'm seeing influencers being like, we have these calls, these Zoom calls, being like, okay, so, you know, what are our alternatives? What can we do? Nothing. They lived the reality that like in their minds, there is no alternative. So what you ended up seeing coming out of the campaigns, except for Bernie, was like a lot of the same bullshit. And Biden is Obama incarnate, Obama 2.0, you know, in some ways worse. And so like that reality is downstream of a feeling like there is no alternatives. And so like what we needed in that moment was precisely what I ended up writing. It is less of a guide for the left than it is trying to force a conversation to happen that nobody really wants to happen between the left and these, security mandarins.
Yeah, it's one of those, I don't even know the ecosystems, I guess, like if we're going to be really broad about it, where you just constantly see any kind of more radical progressive, even takes, not even frameworks, just immediately butt heads with what's considered to be common sense international relations. And we see that so much in New Zealand. We've had people from Te Kauaka, the New Zealand Alternative, on here. Some of the interactions you see with them, when they're saying very like standard Pacific focused international relations critiques, people just don't engage with it even on the basis of reality. They don't understand about militarism in the Pacific. They don't understand the dangers of using the Pacific as a staging ground for US proxy wars, or the threat of nuclear staging here. It's just not something that enters their thinking about it in any way. There's a bridge there that just doesn't exist. And I'm not one to say, oh, we need to slowly move the status quo into a position where it can do this, because incrementalism really sucks. Like it's not really effective.
Our problems are not incremental.
No, but we do need a way to actively and strategically pull the current common understanding of international relations closer to the realities that people on the ground will be having to live through over the next couple of decades as these crises just get worse.
Yeah. And in the West, what I've noticed is the left is really unable to make the connection between domestic leftist gains or the barriers to less leftist gains on the domestic front and its connections to, leftist gains internationally. So, for example, you mentioned you were in, two of the campaigns. One was Elizabeth Warren and, the other one was Juan Castro. And I think Juan Castro was trying to be the next Obama, I guess, a little bit. But in any way, it's a bit of a tangent. But what I was going to say is a lot of these candidates in the Democratic Party, they will have some interesting ideas for the, domestic policies. But what they don't recognize is it's the same forces that are causing, for example, the increased militarism in the Pacific, or, internationally, they are creating insecurity, especially in the global South. It's the same forces that are going to stand against leftist gains in the West. And this connection, I think, is not being made by leftists in the West. And this is the biggest sort of drawback of leftist movements in the West, because they're not able to make this connection. And once I was, I started becoming radicalized, it just took me closer and closer to analyzing foreign policy and international relations and geopolitics, because I feel like we really cannot address, the problems in the global South without addressing imperialism, the head of which is the United States of America. And the saddest thing about this is that they actually have control over the largest military network, or the biggest military in the history of humanity the United States has. And this is not being deployed, even in the democratic interests of American citizens. It is being deployed to secure the profits and the interests of the military industrial complex. And it's the same forces that will stand against, for example, healthcare for everyone in the United States, for, public education, all these things. The same forces that want to profit from people's basic needs are the ones that are causing so much violence in the global South and the current genocide in Palestine as well. So I really appreciate that we have these conversations. We are having these conversations about what is a progressive leftist foreign policy? What should it be? Because people in the West, they have also been propagandized by this narrative that the Western systems are superior. So I feel like, the left in the West has kind of moved away from racist narratives, but they still have racism in terms of the systems. They think that their systems are superior, for example, to the alternative systems that have been experimented anywhere else in the world. And so while the sort of like racist, biological racism is to a great degree addressed sort of like civilizational or in terms of systemic superiority, that racism still exists, and that's what we see reflected in foreign policy. So when the West says these countries are not, these countries are horrible, we just believe it, that that's, they're not democratic or something like that, but we don't make the connections with imperialism and the history of colonialism and the legacy and the ongoing systems that ensure that colonialism continues.
Yeah, I mean, so to your point, at this point, most of the American left, like the overwhelming majority, particularly ones who are like existing in polite society, they have fully invested themselves in what we would have recognized in another era as like just national security Keynesianism or military Keynesianism, right? They're all about redirecting the resources and the authorities and the power of the state toward great power rivalry with China. And for a lot of them, it's a cynical move or a move of political expedience. Like they think the China threat is inflated, and yet they want to, they choose to reify that or to keep inflating it as part of a cynical calculation to implement an industrial policy that marginally increases employment rates in the US, or that provides tax credit subsidies for installing fucking solar panels on your roof. Like, is that going to make everything better? What the fuck are you talking about? Even separate from like zero carbon emissions and like how far away we are from all that stuff. But just the idea that like you're going to invest in a military industrial complex, that you're going to take the resources of the state at the level of like trillions of dollars, and you're going to pour it into what you say is they don't say it's progressive very often, but like the supply side progressives in America, like the Ezra Klein types, the Paul Krugman types, these are like good people in the American context, right? It has to be only in that local context though, because like it's relative. And these fucking guys, they're all about spending a ton of money on capital intensive industries that, when you peel back, like, well, why do we need to obsess so much about where semiconductors are fucking manufactured? It's because they're thinking about a future scenario where we fight an unthinkable war against another superpower, and they want to make sure we can still produce semiconductors to support that war, but also for our vacuum cleaners and our microwaves and our TVs, so that we can like somehow have this imagined normal life while a new nuclear holocaust is happening in the rest of the world, as if it's not going to hit us, and like that's a nonsensical paradigm. But there's a lot of progressives who are captured by this way of thinking. I forget what my point was there, but you got me going.
I think this is like one of those things which has become just very, very recently we've been seeing it play out on the world stage a lot more. I was going to say like more apparent, but it's always been apparent. But we're seeing it like from the podium to a larger extent. I'm thinking about Joe Biden's arsenal of democracy kind of line a few weeks back, where we know that the exploitation to an extent has been pushed offshore. That's how imperialism and colonialism and capitalism work. So that the working class at home and the imperial core are insulated from the extent of the class warfare occurring. And that's not to say that it's like that people are doing well in the working class in the United States, right? But
they're having a rough go themselves. But
yeah, absolutely. But it means that leaders like Joe Biden can say, oh, we're going to bring back automobile jobs for the American working class and allied the fact that they have utterly destroyed the economies in the global south. And so they're appearing to be progressive domestically, but it doesn't really work in a global framework. And to talk about the arsenal of democracy is very much, trying to tie the working class of the United States and the manufacturer of weapons to some kind of progressive international doctrine. And it's deeply fucked up.
Yeah. Yeah. I meant to say this earlier, but like the idea that America needs to spend a bunch of money to become a leader again in manufacturing stuff, producing stuff, like it's such an inefficient like way to allocate national resources. But the farce of it is, especially on stuff like the green economy, and this is where the supply side progressives get captured by like a bunk paradigm. But you produce, let's say for the sake of argument, America becomes the world leader in green tech, right? China's like so far ahead of the US on like solar and stuff that's not really realistic. But let's just say, okay, in that case, you have reshored the world's manufacturing in America. You've reconcentrated it so it's no longer in the periphery or the semi-periphery of the world system. Manufacturing, once again, happens in the United States, okay? Manufacturing was the basis for these other national economies to exist as part of the world system. To the extent, it's not been a great deal for a lot of people, but to the extent that like developing economies were developing, it was on a kind of like export-based level, right? If you reshore all those manufacturing sites into the US, who the fuck is going to buy the shit that you produce? You're creating a crisis of overcapacity for yourself in the best case. Who can afford to buy American green tech once we've created oversupply in green tech, And in the meantime, we're undercutting China has excess capacity in this stuff right now, and we're discouraging others from importing it. We're discouraging others from adopting China's green tech, and we're preventing China's green tech from coming into the US, right? So like we're delaying the transition to a green economy in the name of great power rivalry, but we're also reshoring the entire like manufacturing export-based political economy that was kind of the only rung on the ladder for most developing economies. And we're taking that and putting it back in America. We're telling them to go fuck themselves, go fuck yourself, rest of world. But also we've created a lot of manufacturing output that we need to dump somewhere. So please buy our shit. Like what? And they're going to use IMF loans to buy it. And, like we're trapped in a fucking nightmare. Like we haven't, our national policies, even if they work on their own terms, they end up self-sabotaging when you put them in a global context, and that's in the best case. In the best case, these policies are self-defeating, but it could be actually much worse than that.
So if manufacturing cannot be reshored to the United States, obviously, the people who are saying this do not understand how capitalism works, right? Because capitalism is about creating profits, and it will move to wherever the costs are, minimal. And in the case of China, where, the infrastructure is so amazing that it is conducive to manufacture stuff there. United States has crumbling infrastructure. It's just not going to be a rival to China in any, I can't even imagine that scenario. But if that's the case, then what is the future of the United States economy? Because at the moment, it's not looking very bright. How is the United States going to, address its looming issues of poverty, of homelessness, of insecurity, of a bleak future? All these things are interconnected, right? We're seeing that the life expectancy of the United States is declining, and China has surpassed it. It's just looking really bleak for the United States. So what is the future? It's a bit of a tangent, but what is the future for the United States economy, and how can it address its problems?
Can I have a moment of your time, Josephine, to talk to you about the Forever War?
The political aspects of full employment. Is, right? Yeah.
So
this is, there is no bright future on the horizon. I think the better you understand, how international political economy works, the better you understand how capitalism works, the more you're just deeply, deeply pessimistic about our horizons right now, or like what the future holds. The most realistic thing for the US is that it like turns fascist. It tries to establish a Herrenvolk social democracy, which is to say like an ethno-nationalist state where it's full employment for people who fall into that like white, largely male favoring hierarchy, and it's screw everybody else. And those attitudes already exist in America. They're already very prominent in America. That's what, Trump is an expression of that stuff. And like, that's going to already the national security state provides for American security by taking security from others, by denying self-determination to others. Like the Pacific is the worst about that. It's worst in the Pacific about this, like denying self-determination to others so that you can do your like grand fetish strategy of like sustaining these wars and shit. And so like it's all just like kind of a dead end. Like the only real hope for America is that you get some kind of, growing social democratic coalition within the Democratic Party, which is sort of happening, but actually the Gaza war stuff and AIPAC Israel money is really putting progressives on the defensive. So like we had big momentum toward a social democratic shift in the Democratic Party, and now it seems like that project is a little bit on pause or being delayed. But that's the real hope. And then you get a Bernie or AOC type in the presidency, which again also very hard to imagine. But if you do that, then you can start using the power of the state to fix how the power of the state has been used in the past, which includes like relating to the world in a way that accounts for repair, like the amount of damage that we've done to the global south, or the like ongoing, there's proposals for how to stitch together kind of like restorative justice and social justice and economic equality in a way that's forward looking and not just like self-flagellating, but actually like, this is where green financing and stuff can come in and can play a role, peace building on various levels. And
so we'll stop writing "I'm sorry" on the bombs that we're dropping in the global
on
south.
our rainbow bombs. Yeah.
But yeah, I just you mentioned how the United States is making insecurity in the rest of the world to secure itself. I actually don't think so. I think it's actually making itself insecure as well, right? It's not,
it is. That's how it
so
thinks that it's sacrificing others for itself. What it's really doing is making a nightmare for us all to live in.
exactly. So the US foreign policy is not only bad for the global south, it's actually bad for working class people in the United States. And this money, this billions of dollars, the amount of money that this Biden administration has just been transferring for, to essentially, I mean, in the name of Ukraine or whatever, they're transferring this money to the pockets of the shareholders of the military industrial complex in the form of contracts, defense contracts and that. It's just making things in the United States worse and worse and worse and worse. And so, yeah, for me, it is chaos. The future, if you go down this path in the United States, we are actually seeing a crumbling empire. We are seeing global power shift happening, de-dollarization happening. The countries who have been, suppressed by the United States over the, most of the post-World War II period, and now forming new alliances to get around United States domination. So yeah, I think it's bad for not only the rest of the world, but the working class people in the West. And this is what I think Western leftists fail to recognize, that actually Western foreign policy is bad for them as well. And it's the same in New Zealand. There's one more point. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I agree with all of that. Yeah. Like there's an argument that nobody on the left makes with sufficient seriousness that like peace and establishing peace, which means demilitarizing foreign policy to a very great extent, is a prerequisite to worker power. It's a prerequisite to global solidarity because the forces of the national security states across the world are in opposition to labor power, are in opposition to democracy. And so like peace is the like lodestar or the focal, like it's the thing that unlocks the ability to do so much that the left wants to do, you know?
Yeah, and the other thing was also, I really don't have a hope or, any sort of, hope is the word, for someone like AOC or Bernie Sanders to actually change the United States foreign policy. Just look at what Bernie's been talking about in terms of the genocide in Gaza. And the AOC and all of them seem to have folded to Biden. And in my view, I don't know if it's APEC money, maybe it is. But in my view, it's not really APEC money. It is the Democratic Party and the Democratic establishment, which is just the B team of, the industrial, the corporatocracy of the United States that is standing in the way. So in my view, Democratic Party doesn't hold much hope for the left in the USA. And Bernie and AOC are actually amazing examples of the failure, in my view, of the so-called progressives in the West. I mean, Bernie has just supported Biden's, policy on Israel, for example, which is, he just keeps falling and falling and falling into greater depths of, just makes us more despondent to see Bernie like this, because a lot of us poured so much hope and energies sitting in far corners of the world. We were fighting for Bernie, hoping that Bernie would be, the change we want to see, because people like me, we recognize that what stands in the way for us in the global South is actually the United States foreign policy. Like when India got independence, in 1947, the first election in my state, we got the Communist Party in power with a huge majority. Suddenly, the CIA starts appearing in Kerala. So it's like
surprise.
Anywhere in the world where there are grassroots movements for, progress, ordinary people, working class people, in anywhere in the world, whether it is in the West or in the global South, the same powers will deploy this vast network of military with the most advanced weapons, and also along with that, economic instruments like the IMF to derail our movements. So Bernie Sanders and, Western left have been extremely disappointing. I'm just, at this point, I'm just asking Bernie to fuck off.
Yeah, well, that's all very grim and not wrong, I suppose. The Democratic Party, so I think the left made a mistake investing their hopes and dreams in another human being, because like that's just not how structures of power work. Like, even when you have a super empowered individual, he's super empowered because he's positioned in a certain way in a correlation of forces, like it. And so the idea that like Bernie would be our great savior was not realistic. He's done great in many respects and more than we probably deserved given our politics. But that was not wise to bet the farm on that. But like, what's it? Emmanuel Wallerstein had this thing about the world systems theory guy. His argument was like, elections in democracy are defensive tactics, So as you strategize for power, you don't abandon your defensive flank. You fucking vote for the least harm, the least worst, right? But if the idea that is what's going to be your path to salvation, that's going to be your path to power, that's not realistic, right? So electoral politics is simultaneously something that you have to play and recognize that it is nothing but a defensive tactic. Your sources of power are going to be elsewhere. You just don't want the electoral terrain to tilt too hard against you, because as much as Biden fucking sucks, it's going to get way worse, way fast if it's Trump. And we know this from the Trump years. We know this from the documents he's issuing right now about how he's going to purge government itself. I mean, like, he's going to create a fascist state. America's not a fascist state yet. It's just got the architecture to support a fascist state ready to hand over to the fascist. There's a difference there. And so, like, we have to, like, I would support getting somebody in there other than Biden, almost anybody, right? But if it comes down to November 2024 and it's only Biden and Trump, you're a fucking idiot if you're voting for Trump or if you're voting for nobody. But just voting for Biden should not give you any solace. There's no peace of mind in that. These last 4 years have been like pretending like history is not even happening, like everything's all good, And so strategy or building for power has to come from somewhere else, And the best hope that I've seen, it was the building of a social democratic movement that is, I don't know, nowhere at this point. Honestly, I think other parts of the world system outside of the US might be the bright spot, Lula in Brazil or something. It's promise there.
I want to bring us back to the book itself. We've been talking about pessimism for the future quite a bit. But I think it's really important to, talking about these grand strategies, and that's in the title of the book as well, and the principles from which we can build those. Like, what principles do we use to find those power bases and those alternative strategies outside of electoral politics, which just seems so defunct at this point in the West? Yeah,
I mean, so this is slightly askew of the book, but Eric Ollenwright, who died not too long ago, he had this thing, what was it called? Realistic Utopias or something like that. But he had argued that there were 3 ways of doing a kind of socialistic strategy, right? And it's like one is building power within a status quo. This is like people who work within the Democratic Party and that kind of thing, right? And they call that, he called it like a symbiotic strategy. Well, as we just discussed, that's really not going anywhere anytime soon. And then the other strategy is the exact opposite, which is he calls ruptural strategy, right? This is 1917 revolutionary type stuff. Well, we're not in a position to do that, right? Whether our historical conjuncture is even favorable to revolution, nobody's organized for it, like there's not even a global left at this point, right? So like that strategy is out the window too. And the only other strategy is the strategy of pessimism after the world wars. On some level, it was like what the new left was when it was at its best. Like there's criticisms of the new left that are valid, but it's the interstitial strategy is what he talks about, right? This is where you create spaces of consciousness and spaces of solidarity and reality. You construct reality outside of the control of the state itself, right? Third spaces, if you will, but in like a political sense. And that's where you end up finding refuge in, hip hop, pop culture, creating your own knowledge base, that kind of thing. And there's a huge trap in that because that stuff is not going to be what liberates us, but that strategy is available. Ruptural strategies are not available, right? And electoral strategies or symbiotic strategies, we keep playing that game, but it doesn't look good, right? So those are the 3 strategic options that Eric Ollenwright laid out as being available to us, and they all suck. And this is why the pessimism is valid.
Van, I actually think that electoral politics is a dead end. I mean, it is pessimistic for me because, the systems, Western liberal democracy, in my view, has been set up to maintain the power of the ruling class. So, it seemed to me, looking at the history of Western liberal democracy, it just looks like a sham where, workers are given a sort of a imagined say in the system where actually there's no say. And I do think that, it does seem like there are no ways for evolution, but for me, that is the open, an open possibility. And at the moment, looking at the Palestine movement against, the genocide of Palestine, these sorts of movements are giving me hope. And yeah, I love the mention of hip hop throughout your work. I've been seeing that 90s hip hop, which I love as well.
I'm
I've
obsessed.
discovered
Yeah.
it discovered it later in my life, but this is all I listen to now. And I think that historically, art and hip hop have played art, music, literature have played a role in revolutions across the world. And yeah, for me, I don't think the Democratic Party is a lesser evil. And I actually don't think that, United States is not a fascist power. Like, look at the 20th century alone. United States has been a fascist power in the world. It has killed over 1 million people in the Middle East since, the dawn of the new millennium. And it continues its death dance across the world, not just after 2000, but even before that as well. And the domestic security apparatus has been so horrific to Black people, to indigenous people, to working class people, that I don't know from what point of view can we say that it's not fascist. Yeah, of course it's different perspectives, but I just find that the Democratic Party is not only the problem, not only a problem, it might be even a bigger problem, because it gives us a semblance of being a lesser evil, when actually what it does is it continues the same system that is, killing millions of people, displacing millions of people every year, and drumming, the drums of war, as we see right now. I mean, the AUKUS deal, the rising tensions with China, which you comment on all the time, these are being drummed on by Democrats. And look at Hillary Clinton.
I was going to bring her up if you didn't.
The Democrats will not save us. I hope you didn't think that I was saying that. Like, this is my disaffection with my own, like, the elite part of the ruling class that would invite me to shit, which is basically no more. Like, my disaffection from them, my alienation from them, is the reality that they're perpetuating these things. I would not call them fascist. I mean, that's like a difference of kind or degree or whatever. Like, we might disagree about that. But like, they certainly don't recognize their role in perpetuating these problems. Throw some quick things at you that should be radicalizing to everybody. Okay. 14 million people died as a result of Cold War conflicts, and the U.S. was involved in most of those, okay? There were 60 U.S. attempts at regime change during the Cold War, 44 of which saw the U.S. take the side of autocracy, okay? This is all separate from, like, Vietnam War, separate from the Jakarta method in exporting genocidal tactics to Latin America. This is separate from exploiting the non-sovereign Pacific as a platform for power projection and all these other fantasies and stuff. The war on terror, between 2001 and 2018, the war on terror was at its peak. During that period of time, the number of Salafi jihadist militants around the world increased 400%. That's according to CSIS, which is a ruling class think tank, right? 400%, okay? When you see those realities, when you recognize those numbers, when you recognize the things that are being done in the name of liberal internationalism or freedom or rules-based order or whatever the fuck, it gives the lie to everything, but then the question is, what can you do? And once again, it's like,
no, let's not vote for Democrats. No, let's not say that. The Democrats are doing this. Look at, all these
that's
things
not
you
a
mentioned.
Your opposite. Like, I don't want to get into an argument with you about this. Your opposition to voting doesn't help anything. Okay, it's not like whether I'm not saying elections will save us. I'm saying just check the fucking box and then go protest. Then go have a revolution. Just don't avoid checking the box and let just reactionaries vote. That's insane. Don't give up the field. Contest every space, including the electoral space, but don't think that contesting any one site is going to be the difference. That's the thing. You're worried about the inadvertent legitimation of the ruling class that happens because we ticked a box on a voting form. But like, that's not, to me, reasonable. Just check the fucking box and then keep going on your strategy, keep doing what you got to do. And so like the starting point has to be not vote or don't vote. You definitely fucking vote. But the starting point has to be have a worldview, have a perspective that demands certain kinds of change, and then demand those changes of whoever's in power. And the technique for demanding those changes, it may depend on circumstances. Protest in the street, canvassing, organizing, putting up new candidates. If you are okay with blood on your hands, revolution. You know what I mean? That's the method is open-ended, but having a worldview and then trying to force change to meet that worldview, I think is important. And a lot of times we're like, well, everything's fucked up, but there's not enough of like in what ways should things change? Like, there are people with worldviews, there are coherent worldviews to be had, but there's not like a campaign around them, a concerted effort, what we would call a strategy. And so, I think starting with a goal of anti-militarism or peace or, deconstructing national security states as much as we can is a reasonable starting point. And I think that is what would bridge people who are even on like very different sides of the sort of progressive spectrum.
I think this kind of ties back, and especially the calls to just check the fucking box, into this grand strategy in the book, which is progressive pragmatism. And as soon as the word pragmatism comes up in progressive spaces, people are like, oh shit, no, like don't get into that. Like, now you're being an incrementalist, or you're giving stuff away to the powers that be by taking a pragmatic viewpoint in terms of the power structures that currently exist. But where do you come at that from in terms of the grand strategy around this?
So progressive pragmatism is like, it's a category that's, I think, unique to the US. There's a cross section of like Ezra Klein types. Elizabeth Warren was one of these, actually, where it's like they're willing to do things like national security Keynesianism or industrial policy. She had an economic plan that was called like the Patriotism Plan or some shit. I mean, literally, she was going to do economic, and this was one of my concerns, my reservations with her, in fact. But like, that is pragmatism in the sense that like there's a concrete plan in that way of thinking that is addressing some of the things that we identified as problems of the status quo, problems of liberal internationalism, right? And it's addressing some of those things. The trouble is, of course, it creates new problems, or it masks certain old problems while addressing others, right? So it's like, it's kind of solutionless in my view in a way, but it's a reality. Like, it's not something I was advocating for. It's like, that's a category of person that exists out there. Like, there's a way of thinking that can claim fidelity to sort of like left progressive principles, and it advocates these things that other leftists and progressives would find abhorrent, right? But that person exists, that way of thinking exists. And so it's like, let's talk about that, right? And so that's one of the multiple ways of thinking that the book kind of unpacks.
Yeah. And I think like in the New Zealand context, maybe you'd apply that to leftists that join think tanks or other kind of groups in the PR consultancy space. Like, we're just going to make the Labour Party better. But just become part of that carousel, right? Without really moving the dial in a structural sense, because they're so inward looking in terms of the political project that there is no strategy for significant change.
Yeah. The New Zealand Labour Party is not good. It's the Democratic Party of New Zealand.
It is. It is, yeah. I mean, we've had this discussion on the podcast, and I think this is something you've brought up previously as well, Josephine.
Oh, yeah. I'm not happy with the New Zealand Labour Party. The kindness politics and whatnot, which is all, rooted in neoliberalism. It is.
This is a very neoliberal country, New Zealand. Like, it's jarring, actually.
Yeah.
More so than people admit or are even aware of, I think, because some of the key structures that would hold neoliberalism back were never built. And I think that tends to be the main problem. And it means that like something like what's happening right now with the National Party, they just come in and like, we're just going to get rid of all this stuff. And everyone's like, oh, okay, I guess that's what we expected.
One of the really scary trends that's happening right now globally is like the US is sort of breaking down the structures of the global economy you know, like neoliberal globalization had lots of ills, but it also like created this corporate constituency of people who want stability and like at least not be jingoists. And that is not some great position. That there's no horizon in that. That's not a great position to adopt. But like that was the sort of upside or silver lining of neoliberal globalization. The US is breaking all of those forces down, all of those structures down in favor of nationalist militarism, in favor of like a mercantilism attached to an ethno-nationalism and a patriotism, and then industrial policy and supply chain resilience, quote unquote, and all this stuff is being like pushed under. That's what's holding it all, is these ethno-nationalist containers. You know, the great disturbing trend is that while America is doing that, and while one or two other European nations are doing that, most of the rest of the world can't do that. Literally, you know, like the country who has the, you know, world's reserve currency can pull some of this shit off and throw trillions of dollars at, you know, nonsense industrial policy. But like other countries cannot necessarily do that. And so one of the things that's happening while America is like building a new nationalist type economic structure, countries like New Zealand are still stuck in neoliberalism. Most of the developing world is living under some form of like neoliberal economic order while the hegemon is doing economic nationalism. Like that's the worst combination I could possibly fucking imagine, you know? And that's what we're headed toward. That's what's happening in real time.
That brings us to the second kind of progressive grand strategy that you cover, which is anti-hegemonism. How do you actually see that playing out?
So anti-hegemonism is basically like, it's just anti-imperialism, you know, but from the US context, where an anti-imperialist or self-identified anti-imperialist in the US context is looking at the world and seeing American imperialism and American militarism as at the heart of, it's kind of the root cause, fruit of the poisonous tree or whatever, of like so many ills that we see out in the world, right? And so if that's the root cause of problems, then the solution is to deconstruct that, to like reverse engineer it or whatever, or bridle that shit. And that means giving up dollar supremacy. That means like not having 700 bases around the world. It means not having security alliances sort of in general, or forward military presence in general, you know? And the trouble or the risk or the other side of that is that to do that realistically, it also means coming to accommodations with adversaries, which in America, you know, everything is Munich 1938 all the time. So like the fear is always like, oh, we can't accommodate our adversaries because then it's Munich all over again. But so like that metaphor looms large in the policymaker imagination. And there may be cases where there's something to that. Like, I don't want to apologize for despotic regimes abroad, but the anti-hegemonist posture is a kind of America-focused anti-imperialism. And so, yeah, the everything starts with packing it in, essentially, including, you know, multilateralizing the world's reserve currency if necessary.
How do you implement that, though? How do you get to a point where that becomes a functional reality?
It's super hard, man. Like I
thought it was going to be easy. Damn it!
This is why, in a world where revolution is like not foreseeable at all, there has to be some people who are insiders who are pulling levers, because we want to change how the state. I mean, some of us want to get rid of the state, I suppose. I'm agnostic about whether the state is necessary or not. That's like a meta question. But like the state, as long as it exists, we demand that it relate to the world differently in a less militarized way, right? If the state is the thing where our interests as a collective reside, and there it expresses our collective will, it doesn't do that in the real world. But like, if that's the ideal of what the state is supposed to be, well, then like we have to have operators of it, agents of it that function and pull the levers and do these things, right? And that requires a kind of knowledge base about how you do that. And if you're going to implement a kind of like real anti-imperialism realistically, you have to have people who can actually hold negotiations with adversaries in a way that's going to make them unlikely to move against territories in their periphery. Easier said than done, you know? If you're going to withdraw from the Middle East, at some point you're going to need congressional legislation. So even one superpowered human being can't do that, you know? Like you need the Congress to act. And so like there's a reality about how you pull levers that is just not straightforward. It's not a function of collective will. But if you can create a popular consciousness that military boots in the Middle East is bad, that genocide of Palestinians is bad. Like if you can create consciousness about those things, if you can create consciousness that like American primacy is bad, then that is an entry point for people who are insiders to do something, you know? So like there's this crazy insider outsider dilemma, and you have to decide, like Josephine has clearly decided to be an outsider, and I respect that. And that's basically what I am at this point, because my opinions are intolerable to insiders, you know? But like, if you're going to influence the state's behavior, how do you do that? What are the mechanisms? What are the levers? And like, I ask that as like that's a genuine question that I'm like, I spend a lot of time on, and the answers are not straightforward.
Yeah. In my view, the answer to that lies in our understanding of power. So, for example, it's not that United States common people don't recognize that the military boots in the Middle East is bad. Most United States people recognize this. Recently, there were polls about, ceasefire in Palestine.
Yeah.
I think over 65% of the people want a ceasefire. So again, it's going back to what I said earlier, is that this, the state, as you mention it, is really not representing the democratic interests of the people. It's a facade. It is a farce. It is a putting dust in the eyes of people to create a sense of a say in the system when they're actually not, they don't have any say. And so then the question is, who has a say and who is controlling it and why? And to me, it relates to, the ownership of the means of production, right? The ownership of the means of production in the United States is firmly in the hands of a very narrow class who also want their hands on the resources and the means of production across the world. And this is at the root of US militarism, US imperialism, and USA's internal domestic problems. And so unless we can actually change that, which I don't think we can through electoral politics, what can people do from the inside when, everything is all owned by this narrow class of people who call the shots? They call the shots through lobbying. They call the shots through political donations. They call the shots through media control. They call the shots through all these different means, because, power from a Marxist perspective, which is where I'm coming from, lies in the ownership of the means of production. And these states, like Western countries, are constructed very carefully by the ruling class for the ruling class. And as long as we think that these are actually a means to our liberation, I think they will continue their death dance and their oppression of working class people. And this oppression is not only like, in the mass deaths that we're seeing across the world, that which you mentioned, just before, but it's also through the social murder of working class people in the West and in the global South, right? So if you look at, for example, the Rust Belt in the United States, how the coal miners are dying early, all these things are in the global South, how the mines in Congo, where currently there's a genocide going on, which is also, related to this, the imperialists wanting their hands on the resources there, how that impacts the children there, mining of these rare elements and so forth. So I don't see the answers to be inside the system. And that's the thing for me. I just want to share this, Van. Of course, we are completely disagreeing on this. My hope is actually on the United States power diminishing and, some sort of power realignment happening. And this is how a lot of anti-imperialists from the global south view it, right? Che Guevara very famously said, while envisaging the destruction of imperialism, it is necessary to identify its head, which is no other than the United States of America. So somehow it needs to implode, collapse, something has to happen. And this is going to be in the interest of, the voters that you say who you're asking to vote for a party that has committed all these crimes that you mentioned. I think that it needs to be destroyed, and I can only see that happening through geopolitics. So, for example, the rise of China. I see that as a hopeful moment for the world. You might not.
Definitely not. Let me be on record. I do not see China's rise as a hopeful anything.
I actually do. And a very good example is I'll just give you an example. Recently in the United Nations, after October 7, there was a vote, and most Pacific Island countries whom have been, recently in this tug of war between the West and China, and after China's visit to Solomon Islands in 2022, United States and the West have been, who had forgotten these countries, announcing big aid programs and all those things, and they all voted against the ceasefire. Whereas there was one country that supported ceasefire, and that was the country that had a security agreement with China, the Solomon Islands. And so, and looking at the leftists for example, from Africa and how they talk about China's dealings with Africa, for example, or scholars like Akala talking about China's dealings with the Caribbean, I actually do see hope in that sort of a future. I just don't see it happening through electoral politics, which you don't either. You're talking about, you're talking about opting for the lesser evil in the meantime while we do other things. But I just don't see them as the lesser evil. I actually see them as probably equal or greater evil in terms of their impact on the global south. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about, the party of Obama who simultaneously bombed seven countries, right? Who deported more people than Trump did in his first term. Hillary Clinton, who laughed after destroying Libya, which was the most prosperous country in Africa. So leftists in the global south are seeing this differently, and we see it as, the sort of any alternative at this point to the United States. But I have different views on how China has been operating. Is better than the United States. And interestingly, when I went to a conference in Australia in 2019 at the Australian National University, there was it was a foremost security expert in Australia talking about how, despite its history, we must support the West and the United States because it is better than China. And I asked him over there, like, how dare you? We are sitting in the land stolen from Aboriginal people here, against whom systematic genocide has happened in Australia. And we are all, this is an Asia Pacific conference that we were having. We are all from people who have been, at the receiving end of Western imperialism. How dare you say that this imperialism is better than the other? And, from our assessment in the global south, China is a better alternative.
Yeah, just super quick. I don't want to get into a conversation about China because it's like an entire big thing, but this is a valid point of disagreement within the left. globally and in the US, right? How to interpret China. The one thing I would say is that like no great power is ever going to be great for you. No great power is going to save you. It doesn't matter if it's our flag or the other guy's flag or whatever. That's just misleading, I think. And so there has to be liberation is on the other side of a kind of bridling of American power, I think. But we would call that like multipolarity, right? Post-unipolarity, multipolarity. The problem is multipolarity is not any one thing. A diffusion of power as opposed to a concentration of power is not inherently good or bad. It can cash out in different ways. And the problem is that the kind of multipolarity that's emerging, partly because of Sino-US rivalry, is an ethno-nationalist multipolarity. That is not liberatory, So the multipolarity that is emerging is a terrain that favors the forces of reaction. Full stop. It doesn't mean there aren't good things that could come out of it, but you could say the same thing about nonsense liberal internationalism. There were good things that come out of it, And so like it's the balance. What's the balance of it, And
what
so
what good things have come out of liberal internationalism?
More wealth has been created. I'm not you're baiting me to defend liberal internationalism, and I came on here critiquing it. So thank you, but no thank you.
Yeah, I just don't think it has, but there have been alternatives to liberal internationalism that have actually been good. And I think I can give you the example of Soviet Union's influence in the anti-colonial movement globally, and also the trade union movements here in New Zealand and across the world. There have been alternatives to liberal capitalist and internationalism that have actually supported working class movements across the world. And this is my concern. Either we need a system where our movements in the global south, which have been ravaged from, imperialism and capitalism, which are two systems we can't separate. How can we allow these people to, build the movements that can liberate themselves? We need non-interventionist sort of system. And looking at the history of these great powers, the United States and China, it seems very clearly to me that one is extremely interventionist, and many scholars from the global south have assessed China's interactions with the rest of the world, and actually its history since the war with India in the 60s hasn't really involved in, interventions or wars or anything like that. So, yeah, I don't know. I assess things differently. And for me, it's about what are the principles that underline a state rather than the state itself. In the West, we see states that are underlined by the principle of capitalism and organizing production on the basis of the means of on the basis of private ownership of the means of production and the basis of profits over people. And this is the problem. When we have an alternative to that, globally, I think the left needs to be supportive of it, or moving towards such alternatives. Anyway,
would you say, Josephine, that China is the lesser of two evils?
No, actually, I actually think that China is a progressive force.
Okay.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Hard disagree, but it's getting into this is gonna.
Yeah. It's good though, because what's really it interesting, and when we've had these conversations, when we're getting into like the bigger picture stuff, is the diversity of thought on the left or in progressive circles is far more apparent than anything from the center rightwards. Like there's so much more useful disagreement here.
Also, like the what is to be done question is the area where there's an opportunity for convergence, because my analysis of China, clearly not the same as Josephine's, but on the what is to be done question, there might actually be quite a bit of convergence, because the status quo is a pretty nightmarish trajectory,
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of steps that need to be taken before we get to the point where either China becomes imperialist and becomes a hegemon in its own right, or multipolarity, or China acts as a progressive force. Like we're a number of decades away from that, outside of international societal collapse, which is another problem altogether, and precludes everything. Just before we oh yeah, sorry, Josephine.
I hope at some point that I get to discuss why I think,
We're
China's
definitely going to have that
progressive force.
conversation.
Some other time, maybe.
Yeah, when we
But,
have.
I have a book's worth of thoughts about that. So yeah.
I want to just lastly touch on this final grand strategy, which is peacemaking. And you touched on this earlier, Ben.
You're serious about talking about this book. I keep having like an open-ended conversation. You keep coming back to the book.
Man, like we got to promo you, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
No, like, because this is the thing, is like the left doesn't have a grand strategy, and due to that fact, we have this kind of delineation or divergent endpoints that mean that it's harder to focus on where we do come together, where we do converge. So yeah, I do want to like keep coming back to these ideals and these principles, because it's what helps us build a map for reaching those points of divergence. Which I think should be the end goal of any progressive, is we want to get to a point where our different views of utopia are actually plausible. And because we're nowhere near that currently.
We're so far away. Yeah. No, I get that. Just quickly, the peacemaking view. So these three grand strategies, these are ideal type strategies, which is to say they're like internally coherent logics, right? Surfacing the assumptions, what they prioritize, etc. And then that cashes out as a fully formed foreign policy agenda. And each one has its own fully formed foreign policy agenda. There's areas where they converge, just like there's areas where various people on the left converge. But I wanted to be clear about like what these different schools of thought are. So these are like non-revolutionary leftist discourses about what is to be done, in essence, in foreign policy. And the short version I should have mentioned up front, for progressive pragmatism, the priority goal is equality. And there's all kinds of ways you can cash that out. It's a capacious term, but the belief is that doing XYZ in the name of equality will unlock peace and democracy, right? For anti-hegemonism, the priority is American democracy. De-imperialize, restore American democracy, which is missing in action, and that will unlock peace and equality. And the peacemaking grand strategy prioritizes peace itself. And this is what the New Left movement did in the 60s when it was at its best. There's things we can critique, but it was peace is the way to unlock democracy and equality, right? And so it's not that one of these is right or wrong, even though you could make that argument. It's that these are different ways of prioritizing the same broad ends. And this matters because what you prioritize affects what kinds of policies you ought to try and enact in the world, And so when you make peace the priority, and that's how you unlock democracy and equality, it's a prefigurative logic, which is to say like the be the change type thing, So like you have to act peacefully in the world in order for the world to become more peaceful. Right? The other two grand strategies are a little bit more like calculating instrumental logics. Peacemaking is a prefigurative logic. And so to make the world more peaceful, you have to stop playing balance of power games. You have to stop doing traditional arms racing, militarist geopolitics, and you have to start engaging with adversaries where they're at in reality, and trying to establish cooperative security regimes, arms control, mutual threat reduction, right? And the goal of peacemaking is nothing short of actual disarmament, and the limitation or the scope condition, the non-revolutionary nature of it is that you have to do that in a way that preserves least harm to those who would be affected by what you do. Right. And so you have to, you can't just literally destroy all your weapons on day one. You have to have non-offensive defense strategies. You have to create You have to convert your military into the kind that has soldiers without enemies, right? You have to start engaging in a kind of arms control that's not tit for tat reciprocity. You have to start making unilateral concessions of your own. You have to start deconstructing your own power in a way, recognizing that that's what unlocks reciprocity later from your enemies or whatever. And that's how enemies can be changed into friends. You don't hold a better world hostage because your enemy doesn't do what you want them to do. You have to actually start taking steps yourself. And then that will change the context within which your enemy decides things. And that's how it becomes possible to not be enemies anymore, right? So that's the peacemaking sort of, approach in a nutshell.
Yeah, but how are you going to do this, Van? When you yourself mentioned how, it's not democracy in practice, and, the foreign policy, you were inside that system, is not determined by democratic interests. It's determined by the interests of the military-industrial complex. Convincing people is not the problem. I think people know this, and they are already, tending towards a peaceful sort of position on most conflicts, right? At the moment, these sorts of wars are so unpopular in the United States. But I mean, where I would disagree with you is it's not just, democracy that's not working in practice. The United States represent democracy that's not working in theory. It's set up in ways that are undemocratic, and just an exercise of voting once in 4 years is not any proof of democracy. So
You say that as if I disagree with you, but I feel like I said those exact same things a few minutes ago. I totally agree.
Yeah, but then how is it that we can make this system, which is operating on the intent of profits?
Well, that's the question, right?
You actually accept this is the question. It's great that we argue this and we say this. I just don't think we can unless we unseat these powerful people somehow, which I don't think can happen, which you also don't think can happen. We need to organize outside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think,
is that your solution? Yeah, organizing outside.
Oh, so I mean, yes and no. I think I said earlier, everything has to be contested. There shouldn't be a space that we just abandon entirely. And I think the state and the policy apparatus counts as that too. And so if everything is contested, then you do elections, but you don't count on it, right? You do policy advocacy, but you don't count on it. You do protesting, but you don't count on it. You make a new hip hop record, but you don't count on it, but all of these things together is maybe the source of hope. I don't know. It would be great to end this on an optimistic note.
Sorry,
but
it's but what I'd say as well is as far as the electoral politics conversation goes, the power of the state and the institutions of the state are something that fascists want. I'm going to try and stop them from getting it.
Yeah.
Because without that power, it's harder for them to do what they want to do. And that goes, we'll all have, well, maybe not, I don't know. But out in the real world, there are spaces that white supremacists or fascists or whatever stripe of regressive reactionary politics you want to kind of put on it will show up in your space. And you contest that space as well. One of the kind of paeans around rallying and protesting, if someone shows up with a Nazi sign, you kick them out, or it's a Nazi rally, right? They are actively trying to contest these spaces, and that applies to government. That applies to the state as well. That applies to businesses. I think the reason we don't talk about this a lot, and we don't talk about it in detail or in a way that is maybe useful, is because it just becomes incredibly daunting incredibly quickly, knowing that you're going down to the supermarket, you're going to end up contesting that space at some point, as fascist creep continues.
This is being on the left is exhausting.
Yeah, it is. But this is why it's so important to have these discussions and be okay, so here's the big view, right? Like, what are we working towards? What is the grand strategy? And we've gone through a few of them in this conversation today. And none of them by themselves are going to be the be all and all, right? They all have weaknesses and problems. But having a set of shared goals that we can focus on as progressives, that we can work towards as progressives, and understanding what the core tenets and principles of those are, is something that can give us hope, I think. Because if we know, okay, we want to disestablish the imperial core, like if we want to work against hegemony, then there are active things we need to be doing at any given time in our political activities. And, in New Zealand, that is part of it's going to be voting. We've got MMP, we've got some form of proportional representation here, and getting people within the halls of power who are more anti-imperial, because then they get the resources and access to state infrastructure and institutions where they can pull one or two levers that move us in a slightly more favorable direction to that grand strategy, to the end point. And then, you do book clubs and you do organizing, you get together for solidarity movements and protests. And every step along the way, you are, I think you said it somewhere earlier in the conversation, you're creating that space, Van. You are creating that sense that people do not want, endless war or endless imperialism. And that puts pressure on decision makers, whether political or wherever else, to act in alignment with that, rather than what their natural interests might be as an agent of capitalism or imperialism or what have you. And I think we do see that those changes occur. When we had Tamim on the other week, Josephine, and he was talking about it in relation to Gaza. And he was saying it's good that, these things are changing, but remember that in terms of calling for things closer to an outright ceasefire across the West, but it's not politicians who are making these decisions. It is the people on the ground who are showing their numbers and putting pressure on the politicians to act in that way. And it's a very specific example, but it's broader than that.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's bottom up. Like when you look at New Zealand's foreign policy history, the moments of hope in New Zealand's foreign policy history actually come from the ground up, rather than top down. So yeah, I do agree that that's where our hopes lie. In another conversation we had with Ara Marata, she talked about how she believes in people power. It's people power that can bring these changes that Van and I agree with the demilitarization, peace being a fundamental requirement for liberation of humanity. So yeah, people power it is.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be careful how I phrase this. Every progressive looking, every good thing that's happened in U.S. foreign policy happened as a result of pressure from the radical elements of American society or from elsewhere. Like the elites who control policy never did some great idea on their own. They didn't get out of Vietnam because they thought it was a good idea in a vacuum. They got out of Vietnam because millions of people demanded it. Right now, we're going through a process where Biden is trying to ignore demands for a ceasefire on Gaza for Israel, but eventually the pressure is building. Where is the pressure coming from? It's coming from the streets. It's coming from mass opinion, and it's starting to trickle into things that he pays attention to, like opinion polls, into these, elite brunch conversations that they have behind closed doors. It's translating into the way that they're reframing action memos and policy decisions and debates at the National Security Council. And if that pressure sustains, like the Vietnam War, or it keeps growing, you can't ignore it at a certain point. And it starts to actually affect the decisions and the choices that people in power are making. That should not be that we can't throw up our hands and be like, hooray. But Biden may support a ceasefire between now and 2024 or the next election, right? He might. right now it looks pretty bleak. But like, if he does that, are we supposed to give him fucking credit? No. Who should get credit? The people who've been getting arrested protesting, right? That's how it's always worked. The best of the American tradition owes to radical elements. It owes to mass protests. It owes to that. It owes to critique. There's just a way in which people in power narrate these things in like self-congratulatory ways. So that's something to watch out for, because like the pressure for a ceasefire is so strong. I think it will happen eventually, but in the meantime, it's pretty brutal. And when it happens, everyone who's a Bidenista is going to be like, you need to give this man credit, 4 more years, blah, blah, blah. We need to not, we need to give credit where credit's due, and credit's from the streets.
I think it's a pretty good place to end the whole conversation, because it's been going on for a while, if nothing else. Where can people find your book then?
It's with Cambridge University Press, but it's in all the places where people sell books. So like bookshop.org, Amazon, if you love Bezos. Josephine, I know you do.
Big Bezos fans here on 10200.
Yeah.
Good one, Jeff. Okay, fantastic. And where can people find you online if they want to listen to your musings?
I'm Googleable. I think I'm on Twitter still. Yeah. Wonk VJ.
Fantastic.
Oh, I have a podcast too. You can listen to that.
What's it called?
Undiplomatic. And the newsletter, also called Undiplomatic.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys. This was super fun. This was spicy in the best way. Thank you, Josephine, especially.
Thank you both. And kakiteano to our listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening, everyone. We may, as I said at the start, we may have one more podcast for you by the end of the year. I don't know. It's not in the schedule, but I might just pick up my microphone and blather into it for an hour, just for you. If you've enjoyed this, share it around. There is good discussion about international relations on the left. Like in Aotearoa, it does exist, despite what it seems like out there. I know it looks pretty fucking sparse, but these conversations are happening, and as I said earlier in the conversation, as it did get spicy, there is more disagreement and variation in opinion on the progressive side than there is anywhere to the right of center, where it tends to just not even be talked about. So get involved, start talking to people, share these conversations around, and get organizing, get out on the street and connect with people. That's been another episode. We'll catch you whenever next time is.
There's artifices I deny. Living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paid with good intentions. And I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're on the road